The 89th Texas legislature is in full swing. Thousands of bills have been filed with a whole lot more expected. Accordingly, the debate details on bills can get overlooked, even on critical legislation. That's why we've asked legislators to come to TPPF to discuss their bills to ensure you are on top of the most important issues making their way through the Texas Capitol. This is the layout. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director of TPPF's Taxpayer Protection Project. Today we're discussing House Joint Resolution 98 with Representative Cody Vasut from House District 25. Representative Vasut, welcome to the layout.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. So House Joint Resolution 98 would submit an application to Congress for an Article 5 convention. What sparked this joint resolution?
Well, you may recall about 8 years ago, the legislature had a legislative priority from the governor to call a convention of states in order essentially to rein the federal government in. And that was set as a priority. It passed as HJR 2 back in the 2017 session. There was another resolution adopted, SJR 38, that rescinded some previous resolutions and set an 8-year time limit. So this resolution to rein in the federal government expires in May unless we do something about it. So where this came about was they were looking to extend it, and I was happy to oblige.
So May, meaning it would expire before sine die?
That's right. It'll expire before sine die. So we need to pass it through the House and the Senate, I think, by the end of the first week of May.
So could you take a moment to walk us through the resolution and tell us how it works?
Sure. So Article 5 is in the United States Constitution. The Founding Fathers put in two methods of amending the U.S. Constitution. One was the one we're probably more familiar with. Congress proposes a resolution, and it gets ratified by 3/4 of the states. Well, sometimes Congress may not be willing to do that, right? And so the Founding Fathers wisely put in a second method of amending the Constitution. It was where the states, 34 of them, 2/3, could call a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. If those amendments are adopted in that convention, then they get sent to the states for ratification. It takes the same 38 states to ratify it. So roughly what this resolution does is it calls for an Article 5 convention of the states on three categories: congressional term limits or term limits of federal offices, budget restraints, which we could all agree with, and then as well as restraints on federal power. And so those three categories. Any type of amendment that falls within those categories would be germane to the convention, but anything outside those categories would not.
So how would you say the lives of Texans, everyday Texans, would be impacted if this resolution were to pass?
Well, man, we've seen it firsthand when the federal government doesn't do its job at the border with Mexico, right? And you saw millions come across illegally. You saw fentanyl pouring across our border. You saw rampant crime. The state of Texas had to step up. But what the state of Texas can do is relatively limited. Even the invasion power is not necessarily tested. And so what do you do if the federal government's not doing its job? Maybe you need to cull back federal authority and say, hey, if you're not going to secure the border, then the states have the power to do it. So there's no question of the legality of what the state needs to do. So there's a host of things that where the federal government is over-involved in our lives of Texans, this convention will help with that because we'll be reining in the federal government. So insert any other issue that you think the federal government's too involved, maybe education, and this convention is a good remedy for it.
So there's a small minority of folks who said that they fear a runaway convention. Sure. What's your response to that?
Well, there are several safeguards to prevent that from occurring. First, when the states propose the categories of topics for a convention, they all have to agree. So you got to get 34 states to agree, and that's the agenda. And so it's just like any other convention of states that have happened for interstate compacts. You have an agenda. If somebody deviates from it, it's subject to a point of order, which, that's what I deal with on the House all the time. But let's say that they decide that the point of order is going to be ignored and they go on. Well, the states are the ones that pick their delegates. They get to entrust them. They also have the power to to recall them and give them instructions. Some states make it even a crime for someone to vote contrary to their instructions. So there's several restrictions on the delegates. But let's assume none of that works. Well, then you've got, of course, the delegates' discretion, and if they still refuse their instructions, ignore their states, and propose things outside the confines of the agenda, you still have to have 38 states ratify it. So I always go to this. Think about maybe the worst thing they could do. They get rid of the Second Amendment. I mean, are you going to have 38 states ratify a repeal of the Second Amendment? No. We can't legislate in remote possibilities. We need to legislate in practical realities. And the practical reality is the chances of a runaway convention are slim to none, and there are so many safeguards to prevent it from occurring that I have zero fear of a runaway convention.
Excellent. And lastly, what kind of feedback have you gotten from folks back in the district or folks across the state of Texas on this resolution?
I have a lot of constituents that, of course, want to rein in the federal government. I mean, if we look at the polling data on this, there's broad support, both Republicans, Democrats, and independents, for everything that's in this application. I look back in the 2017 session, it passed with bipartisan support. So this is not a partisan issue. So my folks back home want to rein in the federal government. They want congressional term limits. They want to have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Those two things are never going to happen. Congress is never going to term limit themselves. Congress is never going to adopt a balanced budget amendment. But the states can. And so my folks support it back home.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, Representative Vasut, thank you for joining us in the layout.
Thank you very much for having me.